Welcome back to the Growing Band Director podcast. This is episode number 209. I'm here with Scott Jones from Ohio State University. Scott, how are you?
I'm really great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're going to talk about teaching for musical independence with our students. Really happy to be learning from you today. This is something I'm really interested in improving on this year, among many other things. So I'm looking forward to kind of our discussion and what we can offer other people as well as each other. But before we do that, I'm hoping we can
Yeah,
dive into a little bit of programming and just
sure.
maybe give people, a composer or some pieces to think about. And for background, for people who are listening, you teach at, a large collegiate setting. I'm like a high school band director. So that's sort of where we're coming from. I want to thank Austin Custom Brass for being a sponsor of today's podcast. Trent Austin started this wonderful shop back in the Boston area many years ago and has moved to Kansas City. Check out their unique line of doublers instruments that are perfect for students, band programs, and players of all ages. The Austin Custom Brass Doublers Flugelhorn is their most popular selling instrument, available in 5 different beautiful finishes. These flugelhorns come with a case in Austin Custom Brass's Fab 5 mouthpiece. The Doublers Flugelhorn offers a quality sound, playability, and affordability. Get one for yourself or your whole trumpet section today. Call Austin Custom Brass at 816-410-0826. They are located in Kansas City, Missouri, but they ship all over the country, and they're wonderful humans and great people to hang with. Austin Custom Brass works with band programs from all over the country. They can provide a bid to you today, work within your school's budget, and accept POs. Call their team today at 816-410-0826 or email at info@austincustombrass.com.
Yeah, and as a reminder for maybe those who aren't aware, so 15 years of my teaching, this is year 36 for me, 15 years was K-12 education. So I spent a lot of time. It's actually really only until recently that the amount of time I'd spent K-12 teaching with high school and middle school students was more time than actually collegiate teaching in that regard. Um, so yeah, great question. And the ongoing question, right? Like, hey, what piece have you done that you've really, your students have connected with? At the collegiate level, we're asking that same question of one another an awful lot too. So I'll offer 3 composers that may be a little off the beaten path to some folks. And I'll start with one of our own. And by that, Erica Savano, for those
Mm-hmm.
people who may not know Erica, Erica did a DMA in conducting with us here at Ohio State, and then has gone on to become a full-time composer. And Erica has some really terrific compositions that each of them is really thoughtfully based, grounded in structures of composition, like sound compositionally, but also have a really interesting kind of affect that students can latch onto and listeners can latch onto. And she's got a growing website of more and more pieces all the time that grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and some that are beyond that as well. So she would be a person that I would suggest.
Let's just spell her.
Steve,
Let's just spell her name
oh,
real quick for
sure.
everybody.
Yeah, her first name Erica is Erika, and her last name is Svanoe, Savano. Yeah, and if you just Google her uh,
Of course.
name, it'll lead you right to the website. The magic of the web. The web. Um, a second person is an emerging composer, Kalijah Dunton. His first composition to come out is a piece called Stillwater, or at least the first that I was aware of. And it's a piece that he wrote and was commissioned to write before his formal education as a composer began. So his formal education as a composer is just now in progress. But that first piece kind of enabled a quick look into the mind of this young composer that has some really interesting ideas that are unique and and like with Erica's music, a real graspable affect to the player and the listener right away. I mean, you're just kind of in. There's not much more like, hey, where are we and what's happening now?
Hmm.
So Kalijah is going to be a person that's going to be fun to kind of watch out for as his formal education and his composition catalog grows. And then maybe the last one, just because I've so enjoyed getting to know Steve over the last maybe 6 or 8 years, is Steve Danu, who is based in New York. Um, and Steve has a growing catalog of works as well. His Into the Silent Land was the gateway piece for me with him, and it's a really meaningful work that I've done with like eighth and ninth grade honor bands and had real great success with. It's also been done with university bands and everything in between. So it's one of those pieces that has a real ability to connect with a wide variety of abilities and experiences, perhaps is a better word there. So Steve is somebody worth checking out as well. Um, yeah, so I would offer those. Those are just three that popped at the top of my mind. And then, as we were saying before in our conversations that we've had, Kyle, there's so much music, and there's just so little time in comparison. So,
Right. It's
if
it's
those,
really more about finding the perfect program for the students you have right now. And I preach on the podcast all the time to prepare
yeah,
your program months and months and months ahead of time, get everything prepared, know who you're going to have and all that. Even though some situations, like they don't necessarily know until the year starts. And I get that there's some schools like that, but that programming ahead of time, but I'll tell you, even this year, and I've said it on the podcast dozens of times, I program a year ahead of time. I'm like, I just program when I
that's
finish a
great.
concert. I program that concert the next year because I have an idea who's coming up and all that. However, this year, just this week, both of my
Yeah.
ensembles, I changed a piece after the first rehearsal. The first rehearsal we're
Oh,
going, and I
interesting.
went, wait a minute. I was driving home. I'm like, that piece fits this band. And I don't know why I didn't think of it ahead of time, but it's like this one's moving and that one's going in. And you're right, the programming, it just has to be like right for your kids. And one thing we've talked about with a lot of guests too is like, how do you know when to pull a piece and change to something else,
Mm,
or when will that be demoralizing for them? And I think that's something that
yep.
just comes with experience. We will get right back to our content, but I wanted to thank you for being such an amazing band director, that you're taking your time and listening to a band director podcast. There's many options out there, and I appreciate you very much taking in this content. I hope that you understand that your students are very lucky to have you as their band director, that you're continuing to grow, and that they are going to benefit from your improved skills as a band director. You can share this episode with any band director friends or other music education friends who can learn from this content, because good pedagogy is good pedagogy. And if you could take a moment and go to thegrowingbanddirector.com, and you'll be able to sign up on our Patreon platform to give at least $5 or $3 a month. And it helps the content continue to be created for you to help our profession grow. Let's go back to our scheduled episode.
Yes, yes, and I'll say though, having recently done that, even at the university level, there are just times where you think, "Oh, this program is going to work great," and then you get into a program and you find yourself uh, grasping or wrestling with some other things or some other dimensions of some of those other pieces, and pretty quickly, that moment for me is when it's like, "Okay, look, with finite number of rehearsals left." Do we want to spend our time just trying to get things to stick together and to stay together, or do we instead want to jettison and use that time to go deeper and richer? And of course, the
Yeah,
answer for me is always the second of those.
right.
But yeah, and I do not mind admitting that even after 35 years of experience, that still happens at times, and it comes from a place of love. Like, oh, this would be a great, they'd love it, but it's like a Thanksgiving dinner plate. It's only so
Mm-hmm.
big, and there's a point at which it's just too much food on the plate.
One of the pieces for our second band I was planning on doing, because we were going to have 8 percussionists, and they're fantastic. They're a very experienced for our second band. They play a lot of great stuff already. I was really
Yeah.
excited. Well, when the year started, we had 12 percussionists. There was like
Oh,
4 more, and they were functional, but it's like, okay, now I need something different, because now this boom chick that's
yeah.
supposed to be simple is now way too heavy.
Uh-huh.
Like no matter, you know what I mean? So like sometimes
Yes.
things just change, and you have to be able to adapt to that.
Well, and maybe before we leave this, I just want to name and compliment you. I think one of the big struggles philosophically that all of us who teach, regardless of what the developmental level of our students is we're called to teach the students who are before us and not the students that we wish they were. And in staying grounded to these are the human beings that have the skills that they have and the life experiences they have. I'm called to teach them and giving them what they need is a beautiful way to be in education. So more like you, I say.
Love it. And it's much easier when you've been somewhere long enough and you've learned and you've earned the respect of those students. Sometimes if it's
Yeah.
your first or second year and you're still kind of working through that, that situation could be a little trickier. But
Sure can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right, so let's switch topics and go to sort of our intention for today. I'm
sure.
gonna put my hand up and just say I'm one of those band directors that is really good at getting a band to sound great. And I oftentimes don't have students who are as independent as I'd like. So I'm looking forward to what we're gonna do today. Let's start with talking about you use this word compliance.
Yeah. So, for people who are unaware, I right now I'm on a professional leave from the university. I've got a semester, so I've got time to think, and I'm really valuing that dimension of this leave. And there are two words that I've been kind of rolling around in my head and trying to think more deeply about. And one of them is the role of compliance. And by that I mean this is that I think it's important for us um, as a profession to listen thoughtfully to people who are critical of what it is that we do, because sometimes in doing so we can either anchor ourselves further into our beliefs, or we can be provided with the opportunity to make some adjustments. And there is a kind of criticism that people have directed to us in um, which basically sounds like this. Basically, what you're doing is you're teaching your students to follow directions really well. You're the person who makes the decision in the classroom. Basically, the way the exchange is I tell you what to do, you do it until I'm happy, and then we move on to the next thing. Ready, set, go, repeat. And the criticism comes in like, how creative is that? How free is that for students to bring their own artistry and their own ideas into that? And there, from my perspective, there's some things to be said there, because largely speaking, the traditional conductor uh, is a model that's designed to be efficient first and foremost, which is I have all that we need to make this music work. Everybody follow me, get in the boat. And when I say row, row. And by the way, in the same direction and at the same time. Um, and that dimension of what we do as music educators is an important one. Obviously, I am in no way, shape, or form being critical of performance-based classroom education, because that's where I live and that's where many of us live. But there is a point at which I think we're called to say, hey, yeah, what does this look like to a student sitting in that chair right there? Are the skills that they're largely leaving with just learning that part very well, and me telling them everything that they need to know and do. And their job then is to do that. And then we move to the next piece or the next section, or ready, set, repeat. If that's all the experience is there more to an education in music? And my answer to that is yes, but that's not. It's really not an either or. It's how do we balance all of this out? Um, and perhaps I might also then tie in this second word that comes into play just as an extension of that, and that's what does success look like for all of us who teach? Meaning, if I'm doing this really well, this teaching thing, this band directing thing, if you will, what should that look like on a Tuesday afternoon with students in my eighth grade band, or with my symphonic band, or and these are big questions that there really are obviously are no direct answers to. But I think, however it is that we choose to answer that question of what is success in my classroom, from there then should flow all of the ways that we interact with our students, the kind of music that we choose, how much time we spend with that. You know, the related question is, how good is good enough? Because the reality is there's always better. So when do we just go, yep, that's good? We've got other things to attend to. Um, so yeah, success and compliance, and if compliance is really um, the central hallmark of success, well, then that classroom is going to look very different than somebody else who says, well, yeah, I want my students to be able to obviously play together, but I'd like them to figure as much of that out as possible. And then I'm happy to take care of the things that they, based on their years of experience as a musician and as a human being, those things that they just will never get themselves to because I'm farther down the road than them and have music degrees, yada, yada,
Yeah.
yada. Yeah, maybe, let me pause there and just kind of
There's so
say, how
much
does
to
that seem?
there's so much
Yes.
to unpack.
So,
Excelsior Music Publishing is proud to sponsor the Growing Band Director podcast with a roster of imaginative composers, including composers who have been featured on this podcast, such as Carol Britton Chambers, Laura Estes, and Tyler Arcari. Excelsior Music Publishing provides new music for concert band, jazz ensemble, solo and ensemble, as well as books and resources for all levels and occasions, including a large and festive selection of music for your fall, holiday, and Christmas concerts. Find your perfect next piece at excelsiamusic.com. That's EXCELCIA music.com. There's so
yes,
much
I'm sorry.
to unpack.
Yeah.
I had to write feverishly because I knew I would. I'm a trumpet player. I forget everything.
Oh,
So unless it's
no,
pieces, I remember pieces, but everything else I forget.
no,
Okay, so
I get it.
going back to choices.
Sure.
Because the first thing we think about is we think of our average student and we think about what
Mhm.
they know as a musician and their experience level, and then what we know, and it's easy to say, okay, well, I don't trust them with this,
Yeah.
like that's a normal thing. So what I wrote down was that if you're going to give your students choices musically, I guess we'll say musically speaking, as a
Yep.
group and individuals, then
Mhm.
I wrote that it needs to be grounded in two things.
Yeah.
One would be their humanity. Like it
Mm.
needs to be grounded in their life experience and their musical choices and all of that stuff.
Yes.
And every age of student, because my wife teaches middle school too, and you
Ah,
can do this, but the younger they get, she'd be like, "Are you crazy? Well, you can't do." I'll tell her something I'll do. You're like, "I can't do that with a fifth grader, or else the room's gonna explode."
yep.
So it has to be grounded on sort of their level of humanity, what they can offer. But then
Yes.
secondly, it has to stay grounded in the composer's intent too, right? Because you don't want to,
True.
with probably some exception. I mean, there's probably some way to walk that line, but how do you make sure that you're allowing them to continue to come up with ideas and choices and ways to do things, but also staying, okay, well, this ex composer decided this for a reason, so
Yes.
we probably should follow that.
Yeah, and you've touched on, I think, a really important distinction that's worth naming at this point, which is that second piece, this composer's intent piece. I think that's really one of our responsibilities as the professional educator in the room, that we can bring students into a bit, but they only know what they know. And that's not saying that they're not smart, they're not capable, they're not, but it's where they are in their journey. And so my at least for where I am today with this, I would say that realm of information and feedback and contribution from us as a teacher, I think that's a place that we're called to contribute there. The question then comes, I guess, is those other things that sometimes we get completely consumed with, which are the technical dimensions of music making. And is that right? Is that together? Is that in tune? Is that stylistically grounded? All of those things. Those are things that, assuming that students are presented with a challenge that is appropriate for where they are in their development, those are things that they can attend to. And I think the challenge, if you will, to use that word differently now, for us as teachers, is to not take on the responsibility uh, of of nurturing compliance with the things that the students could actually be doing themselves,
Mhm.
and instead put our energies into that much more sophisticated, professional, thoughtful, deep. We're the ones study the scores, so we can make those contributions, and to make sure that those two sets of skills stay separate.
Right.
Students getting more independent in their skills and understandings of what it is to be alive through music and to play their instruments, and then our contributions as interpreters of this music for this performance on a given day or time.
I think a tangible way to mention this, something I did this week, we're working with one of my groups on Safely Rest by Nicole Puino. It's a great
Mm-hmm.
piece that uses taps as well as Amazing Grace, and it's just gorgeous. I mean, rhythmically, it's very
Awesome.
simple, but it's one of the most gorgeous pieces you're going to hear at the grade three and
Yeah.
a half or whatever it is level, and it's just awesome.
Yeah.
It's one of those pieces that you go, I don't care what grade this is. This just sounds awesome,
Yeah.
and very very minimal ranges and all that. Anyway, so there's a section of this piece, how we all have done this. There's a crescendo and it gets to forte, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
no other dynamic for 10 bars. So what do the kids do? They just get softer, and then you have to remind them, no, this all stays forte.
Yes.
So what I did is I said, but she doesn't want every note to be forte, right? I said, you're going to play
Yes.
it like a bot.
Yeah.
You don't
That's a
want
great
that.
analogy.
So we
Yes.
talked about, and I had them write in, go ahead and write in decrescendos and crescendos where you think it would work in your part. And then let's do it. And then let's do it again and change it, that whole aspect of it. So they have some sense in that when I told them we as a group need to be forte, but you now have some say as to exactly what that looks like for you. And then I have found that in my experience doing something like that, they rarely make poor choices.
Yeah. They surprise us again. And that loops back. I wrote down the word trust that you mentioned a few
Mm-hmm.
moments ago. In that, like trusting that their ideas aren't always going to be uninformed and trusting that actually they may surprise us. And as you are naming, and all of us know, our students surprise us again and again and again with the ways that they see, feel, hear, think, and are in our world. It's very
Yeah.
humbling, actually.
Yeah, and I remember
Yeah.
sometimes I will have to adjust it. Like maybe it's the clarinet section and they decided to decrescendo as it goes down to a low G, right?
Mhm.
And I might have to jump in and say, actually, here's why we want to not do that because it already gets soft down there. So maybe, little things like that. That's I think where our role comes in. And so next I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of talk about this whole thing of success
Mm.
we
Yeah.
talked about too. So I was jotting down notes like you were asking me roles of success, and this is probably not cohesive answer, but three things I wrote down was one, I want my students to learn to work hard because so
Mhm.
many students don't have that naturally. Maybe they haven't been given that by parents, or maybe they just tend to be lazy, or, for whatever reasons in society, they don't know what it's like to work hard on a team. So I want them to work hard to strive to something. I
Mhm.
want them to sacrifice for other people. I want them to work hard
Mhm.
knowing it's not all about them, but they're providing a function and a role in the group. And in that sacrifice comes your growth, comes your meaning, if you will. Like your other people are depending on you and all this. And then lastly, the thing I struggle at that I added at the end is I also want them to be independent in that. I want
Mhm.
to not be there and have them and know that they're still, working hard and they're still sacrificing for other people. So everybody's going to have their own answer. For me, that's sort of
Yeah.
my definition of success. And I try to not mention anything about what grade level we're going to play. I try not to mention anything
Mhm.
about, how we're going to sound, even though obviously that's
Absolutely.
really important.
Yeah. Well, first off, great list, which I resonate with. No surprise to you, deeply, and in particular, I think understanding the role that we each play in one another's lives, and of course, in for all of us in ensemble education, it's all inextricably linked. Uh, as a matter of fact, I have often, Kyle, said at moments like with guest conducting engagement or an all-state concert or things, and sharing with the audience that one of the things that I think is so valued, but sometimes gets lost in coming to a concert and seeing and hearing what's happening before you, is that one of the great gifts of being in an ensemble is you are continually learning that you have to put in almost every case your own desires behind the need of the greater whole, the greater community. And you learn that just because you want to do something a certain way, your job is to be supportive of and to play a role in the lives of everyone else through sound in this case. But in that pattern of continually learning what's my role, what's my responsibility to others, how am I accountable to others and sacrificing for them, I'm learning how to, in my own biased opinion, to be a better human being and to be a better person. And then I think really, truly, with the amount of repetition that our students get with that process and that way of being in the world, I choose to believe that helps to create better humans and people who are more than concerned about what's happening across the street with their neighbor and how can I help and how can I serve and what do we have that we can share and those kinds of things. So, yes, yes, yes.
And there's so many great ways to work on that with imagery and stories and all that with your students. One that just jumped to my mind real quick is, yeah, I even used it again this week, but I've used it a bunch of times. So my students hear it and they're like, yeah, we've heard this one before, but we only have so many things that we think about. So one is when you have clearly a background part, the clarinets have all whole notes and then everybody else has this moving part, right? And those notes are very important. However, they are the background. So we talk about, if you watch a play and it's Little Red Riding Hood, well, if the
Yes.
forest in the back is a beautiful green forest, then that sets exactly what you need. It tells you everything that you need to know about the scene. Whereas if it's a terrible tree, that isn't gonna tell us what we need. So
Sure.
you just be the best tree in the back that
Yeah.
you can be. You're not gonna like hit, Wizard of Oz style. You're not gonna like throw apples at the lead people or anything like that. You are in the background, but it's very
Yes.
important. So, little
Yeah.
simple ways like that to let them like just, okay, that's cool. I like supporting somebody else.
Yeah. And you're still visible. You're still present. You're not, it's not disappear. It's,
Mhm.
we don't want to not hear you, but just be part of what's in the frame, if you will, in that regard. Yeah,
You
it's
could even
great,
use another
great
one that
analogy.
just came to me, in drama. What about the person doing the lighting? Like they're wearing black, you don't see
Ah,
them at all.
sure.
But if they turn that light off, things change.
All, yes, change. That's a good word there. Yeah. And go
So,
become terrifying.
it's
Yeah.
also a way to take something that's non-musical and kind of relate it to the
Yes.
musical aspect of that. So,
Well, and that's so important all the way
yeah.
across that whole idea.
Imagine if your bus driver doesn't show up. You're not going to
Yeah.
school, or at least you
Yep.
might not be going to school. So,
Yeah.
um, so
Awesome.
next you talk about like the how. There's a specific
Yeah.
way of approaching teaching in order to be able to work on this musical independence.
Yeah. So I think for me, uh, uh, I had a variety of teachers for whom teaching me to be able to do things on my own was the primary way they were wired, if you will. So it's again through the lens of compliance. They're not just wanting me to do things well when they are prescribing exactly what it is I need to do. They're more interested in giving me skills that then I can apply to a new context and navigate my own way. I mean, it's very much it's a rather parental in that regard. When the
Mhm.
when the parent bird kicks the baby bird out of the nest, you hope the bird's going to fly and go off and do all the things that birds do to have a good, successful, meaningful, and long bird life. And it's very much that same way. So that resonates with me. And then the question then becomes one that is housed in transfer. So if I want students to be able to play their instrument, so let's suppose poof, that student that I have in my classroom now, let's leap ahead 20 years and it's a rainy afternoon and they decide to pull out of their closet their instrument and open up music that they've never seen before and play. My hope is that they're going to be able to navigate that new music in a way that provides a sense of reconnecting to memories from their past, but also give them a great sense of enjoyment that they don't need anybody to tell them whether that's right or wrong. They actually deeply know that what they've done is correct. And then they bring some of themselves into that. How do I feel today? And how do I want to shape that? All of those things that no music teacher alive would ever go, well, no, I don't want that for my students. But where we tend to be too generous is that transfer in learning. So the skills from one setting applied to a similar but unfamiliar setting, it's far less automatic than any of us think. So if I'm going to teach students to be able to transfer any skill to a new setting, I have to teach in specific ways, and they need practice with encountering new settings and those skills under my care. So, for instance, and I've shared this story, and you probably had this experience, and those watching probably will too. I remember as a young teacher deciding my students are horrible in compound time. We're going to do a 6/8 march. And so we worked on this march and we worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. Did the performance, it went well. This is great. Next repertoire comes out, and I handed out another piece in compound time. And I thought, well, we've checked all those boxes, ready, set, go. And
Clueless.
they started to play, and it was like, no, guy, wait, time out. It's the same stuff you just did. And frustrating, of course, and a great lesson for me because I just assumed that because you've been playing this piece for 6 weeks and gotten good at it, that means you understand it and that you can apply those same things. Nope, doesn't work that way. And I think that that's maybe one of the biggest opportunities for us as teachers in kind of this moment of thinking about things. That transfer is a very specific approach to teaching, which looks different in the classroom than it does of just getting a group of people to do things together well. So with enough repetition
Hmm.
of the same thing again and again and again, you can get the sense that like, wow, they've got this figured out. But until they have the opportunity to be presented that same material in a slightly different setting, and then to say, okay, go without me, ready, set, go. We really don't know if they've gained those skills. And so first book recommendation, I'm going to start with this one. So Bob Duke's Intelligent Music Teaching. Bob teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. The chapter on transfer in this book was life-changing for me, and it continues to be as I reread the book. So this is it's not a very thick book. It's available on Amazon, but it's these essays on the core principles of instruction in music are just really rich. In some cases, not with so much here, do this and you're going to be a great teacher, but things to think about and things to understand about how the brain works and how learning works, in particular in music in that regard. So
So
yeah,
if
this issue of transfer is huge.
so if you're going to go back to your younger self and say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, now we're going to teach 6/8,
Yeah,
but I want to do it in a way that I know my students are going to remember. Can I just throw one thing in that I
sure.
do and I
Oh yeah,
mentioned before, and then I want to hear what
please.
you would do differently? So we've used for a long time in Westbrook, we've used nursery rhymes because kids know how they go. They
Mm-hmm.
know these songs, the Wheels on the Bus and the Itsy Bitsy Spider, and all the tunes that they know. So
Mm-hmm.
when they start from the ear first, right? Sound before sight, and then
There
they
you go.
see it, then I mean it's simple. And then that so we have a couple different volumes of these nursery rhymes for band, and they're in unison and they're simple and all that. If anybody wants to reach out, I'm happy to share those PDFs with you. But nursery rhymes
Awesome.
are kind of like our way of getting kids comfortable with 6/8. It's less
Great.
about how you count it. We definitely get to that, but I mean, in rhythm, in six
Yeah.
eight, how many rhythms are there? Like
Yeah, right.
five?
Yes. Yeah.
It's
Uh-huh.
like there's so little. So to me, if they can understand that, then maybe the counting would come later. But I'm
Yes.
I'm I'm curious, A, what you think about that, and B, what you would do if you went back all those years and did that differently.
Well, let's start with the second question first. Well, actually, no, let's go to you first. Yeah, brilliant. The whole idea of teaching the sound before the symbol, way to go. Like core principle of rhythmic instruction, in particular, because in that is how most of us learn to read. We learn to speak and to recognize things in our world first, and then we became very familiar with how varied they were. And then we started to connect words, letters in a certain order with this thing that we already know.
Mm-hmm.
So the toddler learns what a dog is, learns that there's lots of different kinds of dogs, and that some dogs are tall and some have a tail and some don't have a tail, and how that all works. And then there's this magical day where somebody says, see these three letters in this order, those three letters, and this thing that you already have a lot of experience with and are comfortable with, they mean the same thing. And then all of a sudden vocabulary has started to form, and it's stable vocabulary because there's been all of that interaction with this thing first. So yes, sound first, symbol second. Brilliant. So
Another
what I
quick
didn't
way,
do,
sorry,
yes, go.
another quick way you could do this. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Other than 6/8, say there's this
Uh-huh.
rhythm that a new piece is going to come in. Maybe it's 1E a two or something like this. You
Mhm.
do call and response with your band for a couple days, and you don't even mention how it reads. But once they get
Exactly.
comfortable with how they play it, you say, okay, this is what it looks like, and here's how you count it too. But just even if it's not a nursery rhyme, finding a way to introduce it for a while before they actually need to read it.
Absolutely. You and I have ended up now moving deeply into understanding rhythmic independence, which ultimately would be the label I would use. I didn't at the time as a young teacher. What I was wanting my students to do is to have a much more rich rhythmic vocabulary in 6/8 time. What I didn't realize is that a rhythmic vocabulary, like many other skills in music, is best developed out of a context, not in one. I was thinking, I'm going to use this piece to teach these rhythms. Bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
That would be like, here you have no idea what a dog is, and I'm going to show you the three letters in that certain order for dog, and then try to also introduce you to this big furry thing that licks your face and does all at once. Well, the opportunity and the reality is that that connection between the symbols and the thing is likely maybe never to take root without a lot of crazy licking and all kinds of
Mhm.
things in play. And so, what I would have done differently is what you just described, which is let's just spend some time before the music even got to them in 6/8 time. I play, you play. I clap, you clap. I clap, you play. I play my instrument, you clap. Yeah, we count. We just get all comfortable with the rhythms that they're going to encounter, and then find a way then to develop these things you already know. Here's what those look like, and like you said, I don't even need to worry that you're counting them yet. Here's just what the symbols are. This thing you know, and this and these symbols in this order, they're the same thing. And then I would make sure that they were comfortable with that. Then when the music comes out, they're looking at stuff, and all of the symbology on that page is familiar. When I was starting with students, we couldn't even get through the first like 9 measures
Mhm.
without stopping. And that brings about another question for all of us to teach, which is when sight reading a piece, how much of how much of that composition should be in hand in our group for it to be a piece that's really viable for performance in X number of weeks. That's another decision we're constantly making. But I would purport that there's an awful lot of time where we program repertoire that is asking them to do things that they're not yet ready to do, and we think that that's actually the purpose of the piece, is to teach them those things. The teaching of those things needs to happen out of a context, and then the context is the piece. And when that gets right, oh my gosh, teaching becomes and music making becomes such fun for our students because we're not stopping for those things.
And,
we're,
be,
we're
and because of that, you're going to have more kids in your band because they're going to love it
Yes.
more because they're going to
Yeah,
be connecting with it more too. I also want to mention
exactly.
the modeling piece. There's some people who
Mm-hmm.
literally just conduct their band all the time. Now,
Yeah.
I've been conducting for a long time. I have degrees in conducting. Obviously, you're a college professor.
Sure.
We believe in conducting. But
Yes.
if you're just conducting to your band all the time, yes, there's definitely roles of how you should be doing that. But I
Mm-hmm.
have so many students that need to hear me pick up my trumpet and play a phrase so that they can
Yeah.
copy it. Because where else are they going to hear a professional musician play something that
Yes.
they're playing? And that
Absolutely.
copy me, play along with them, I think is very important. As a younger teacher, I didn't do it. It was all, nope, here's the baton and I'm going to show you it. And then you're responsible for doing that.
Yes.
I play more and more. And then as we get closer and closer to concert, I'm conducting more and more.
Yeah, Kyle, that's beautifully said, and yeah, an extraordinary way. I wish I had been much better about all of that in my teaching, especially in K-12 education. Um, you're right. Our students need a sound is worth 1,000 words. That whole kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not in terms of here's how this rhythm goes, but listen to what I do with this phrase. Listen to my tone quality. What do you introduce? Those kinds of things to have a model like that, so important. And yes, time on the podium, we shouldn't need to be on the podium all of the time. And I think sometimes we think that, like, if this is too simple a setting for a second. So, gosh, my group struggles. They slow down. The farther they get in this piece, they slow down. And there's a certain kind of moment where a teacher goes, they need to watch better. Nope, they need better pulse. And those two things are very different skills, but very often for somebody who is very centered on the podium, it's like, hey, gang, nope, you've got to watch better. Well, the reality is, if they had a really good sense of pulse, they wouldn't need to watch and they wouldn't also slow down. So, how do we work on pulse with a group? And quite honestly, one of the easiest ways to do that is to not conduct and to
Mm-hmm.
get them sensitized to, is this slowing down? And how many people, then you just figure out a game to play,
Yeah.
in that regard. So, yes, less time on the podium, more time teaching.
So a couple more things that I do as a
Sure.
more experienced teacher that I would have when I was younger. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll say this, I started doing it in the historical jazz setting, but now I've done it more even with bands. If you put on a recording of the Ellington Band and have
Yeah.
your students have listened to the chart maybe 10 or 15 times. Now go ahead and play with it. Like have the entire band play with the recording.
Mm,
Now, some people would
mm,
say that's 100% cheating. Well, I would say if I had the Ellington Band in my band room, that would be pretty awesome. And they just got to sit next to them and play. So I
yes.
found that if I do that a little bit, they're experiencing the piece. And no matter how they play, the Ellington Band is still great. Right. And then I notice all of a
Yes.
sudden I turn the recording off and they're far better at the piece than I ever expected them to be. Now, maybe some people would say, well, they just learned it by rote. Well, we don't
Mm,
just teach by rote in my program. So I'm not, if I did only this, they might have a point. I just think that's been a really powerful piece. I've done it with times when I've combined my two bands. And the piece we're
Mm,
doing is serves a certain purpose, and it's a little simple for the older band, but it's a little
mhm.
hard for like a third of my younger band. It's like, well,
Sure.
if I put the recording of the piece, it's like they're playing with our older group, and that helps them kind of get through some things. Again, I wouldn't do that if it was a piece just for them, and I wouldn't do it very
Yes.
much, but that is a way for my students to be able to now I then turn it off and I'm like, "Oh, they know more because they have an idea about it." It's like they're sitting next to an older person. I have a divided band where it's like older
Uh-huh.
kids are here, younger kids are here. But I have a lot of
Mhm.
friends who say, "No, I want my whole band together because I want them together because I want the freshman sitting next to that senior. And when they can't play the rhythm, I want that kid pulling. Like that's how I learned. I didn't learn from a teacher that it sounded like this. I learned from that kid over there, and then I just
Yeah.
started copying them.
Yeah.
So
Well,
modeling.
and yes, modeling, and in the jazz idiom, particularly style. And so you mentioned the Ellington band, like, wow, that issue of really hearing how style and inflection works in that medium is so critical to honoring it and listening and playing along in that regard. I would imagine that would be a massively impactful way to help them get further along in their sense and understanding of that piece or that genre or whatever it is that you're focusing on. So yeah. Yeah, isn't it great that we just start to figure out so many we've a number of times already. It's like, well, when I was younger and what I now know, it's like, yeah, that's right. This is the gift of being older and more experienced in this.
What's
So,
something else you would tell your younger teacher self?
oh,
I've
wow. Hmm. I think well, this is a little off the topic, I think, of maybe where we've been talking in general. But I spent partly out of sheer enthusiasm to finally be teaching. I was that kid in sixth grade who went, "I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a band director." And so when I finally got to start doing this, I was just so excited. But it would probably tell my younger self to say, "Hey, take some time away, balance some things a bit, work a few less long hours every day, still be effective." But I think I equated early on that time meant impact, and it's not always the case. There's a way of becoming more efficient and more streamlined, more thoughtful in what we
Mhm.
do. And so I probably have just said, hey, crack open a book every now and then, which
Mhm.
and sit down and just unplug from that.
Can
Uh,
I ask you a follow-up question to that?
sure.
Because and I'm interested to see what you have to say about this because I think there's a couple different thoughts in band directing, right? Older band directors, and I'll put myself in that category, think, you have to work really hard to build a
Mm,
program, and without that hard
mm,
work, you can't build a program. And
yeah.
then there's also a lot of younger students who are learning to be band directors and now are band
Hmm.
directors. And I've seen this. We've been in music ed seminars, and
Yes.
we give a presentation, or whatever, and then somebody says, what do you do for me time? And
Yep.
I remember my wife saying, I didn't take me time. Like I didn't have kids. I just did
Yeah.
what I had to do to help our program grow. And once it got to a
Yeah.
point, and then we had kids, then you go, okay, let me do some other things differently. So I'm all for the boundaries. I think that's really healthy and really important. But
Yeah.
what do you say to a young teacher who maybe isn't like willing or ready right now to understand that they have to work really hard to get this program that they're taking over to be in a better place?
Yeah, and I'll say I think this is where university programs, and of course we've got colleges and universities who are doing great work across our country, but I think this is where colleges and universities, especially with undergrad music ed majors, are called to be really sure that we're sending our students out into the professional world with the right skills that they need. Because quite honestly, the better the teacher you are, the less time you end up spending trying to figure something out. So there's an efficiency that comes with time, where like, at this point, if student X walks into a room you've never met before and they play four notes on their instrument, right away your brain goes, whoops, yep, I know what we need to do next. Here, give me this, try this, do this, blah, blah, blah. And early on in our career, it's like, okay, well, let's do that. So all of that time then that it took to really understand. And for me, it was getting a couple of years under my belt and realizing, you know what? I got an A in woodwind pedagogy, but I'm not a woodwind player. And what I'm realizing is I don't know what to do about that sound on clarinet. Like, why do my kid, what is that sound? Like, I don't know what to do. And having to get over the, I can't have all the answers, but I've got this friend who's a clarinetist, and I can just say, hey, Debbie, what is, so I'm hearing this sound. What is this? And what do I do about it? And how do I help them? The minute that there was like a human being connected to the clarinet, it was like, oh, now this matters to me in a way that it didn't when it was just like play line 7 on page 28, to
Mhm.
get through the exam. So, yeah, I think that we just need to be really sure that we're just not moving people through the same curriculum that we've always done and assume that just because they can demonstrate something well on the clarinet, for instance, that means they're ready to teach the clarinet, because those are, I mean, there's a relationship there, but it's not necessarily a direct line. So, yeah, and the generation of students that we're having at college and universities now, largely because of the pandemic and all of us kind of reprioritizing some things in our life. We were talking about this earlier, you and me. There's an awareness of like, hey, wait, life's short, and that's true. Um, and maybe it's worth, Kyle, if you don't mind, my side, just let's stay on this time thing one more moment, because I was having a conversation with a colleague in another part of the country who's also a college professor, and we were talking about kind of what it's taking, the amount of time that it's taking for a young teacher to commit to being successful in early in their career. And the topic was, we're losing teachers. We're losing teachers. Like, look, I also want to meet these goals of mine in my personal life, and I can't do that and also spend all of this time and doing what it is that we do. I would love to know, in addition to the time during the school day, how much time, generally speaking, is a teacher relatedly a student expected to spend outside of the school day on top of, in order for our programs to quote unquote be successful? Now, again, we're back to that definition of success or whatever that looks like. But it would be really interesting to know how many times, maybe beyond the time that by law we get in the state to teach, we've now has become the norm, in order to continue to meet standards, whether that's a rating at a contest or our own set of expectations for where things are. But I would love for us to have that data, because I think it would probably give us pause that there are an awful lot of hours that maybe we don't even realize that are in play now, that have now become kind of the norm. Um, and should those standards, so for instance, at a large group festival or contest, should those be predicated on not only 5 days a week, if you see them 5 days a week for 55 minutes, I'll just use that to start with,
Mhm.
plus another 3 times that amount? Like, that, should that be what superior is, or what a one is in that regard? And of course, nobody would probably say that that's a good idea, but I wonder how close to that we are, because the number of extra rehearsals and sectionals and it can kind of is like water. It can kind of go, and there's no indictment there. Don't misunderstand. I like been there,
Mhm.
done that. We always want more time, but the reality is, at some point, um, there's a point of diminishing returns, either personally or keeping great teachers in our profession, or our students who are just like, well, I guess band's not for me because I don't have that much extra time outside of school to do.
Mhm.
I also want to be, X, Y, or Z. So more questions and not many answers, but
It's funny because I think everybody's answer would be different, right? Different
yeah,
situations. In my
yeah.
circumstance, I teach with my wife in the same program. She's middle
Uh-huh.
school, I'm high school. We have another teacher as well, but over dinner, we'll go weeks and not talk band at all. But some days she'll just be like, "Hey, I got this question. What would you do?"
What
And
would you do? Yeah.
it's not work because I'm talking to my wife. We're just
Yes.
talking about what we love. But
Yeah.
because of that, I don't have to do that at work because I did that here.
Hmm.
So most people are not in that situation. I
Yeah.
think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, right? No, it shouldn't be your
Sure.
whole life. But
Yep.
at the same time, my one of my mentors, Jeff, who started this podcast with me, he would always
Yeah.
say, "Do you want to be good?" Because yes, you don't want to put in all this extra time that you don't have to. I agree with that. But
Right.
if you just are sitting on a beach all the time and you haven't ordered any music and you have, you know what I mean? Like
True.
there's
Yeah.
like professional responsibilities that if you're
Hmm.
smart and you're like, we all know those people who just get it done. Like, I'm not
Hmm.
saying just spend all your time doing one thing, but no
Yes.
matter what, I can, like, I have a couple teachers I teach with in the marching band setting, Missy Shabo and Adam Newton. They're middle school teachers. I know that
Uh-huh.
whatever happens, they're going to get it done with whatever students they have.
Yeah.
That's what I want in teachers. I want people who say,
Hmm.
you know what, I'm going to be reasonable in my expectations of the kids, but we're going to get it done. And they do lots of other things too. Then there's
Great.
other people that you have to like kind of babysit because you don't know if they're
Mm.
actually going to get it done. So I don't know how to
Right.
put that into words, but I just feel like people need to know there is a hard work element to this.
Yes. Yes, without question. Yeah. Anybody who is going to be extraordinary at what they do, and of course, we're in the people business. So if we're going to be extraordinary at teaching human beings, there's an effort that requires. And oh, by the way, it's also really messy work. It is not linear.
Yeah.
It just, again, moves like water. And that's some of the beauty in it, too, I think.
Well, one of the things that I think we're going to get to now is
Yeah.
beginning with the end in mind.
Yeah.
And you mentioned different flavors of independence within, what we do.
Yeah, so I think, and this is review for probably everybody looking at this, but the more that we can envision clearly what it is that we want our students to be able to do at the end of any intentional sequence of teaching, the more clear that is, the better our teaching and our sequencing is. So, for instance, like one of the ways that students can be independent is just how they come into our rehearsal rooms and prepare for what it is that we're going to do. Like that's viable teaching uh, stuff. A student just doesn't realize that you come into the room and you get your instrument out and you warm up, and there's specific things you should be using for warming up and things you shouldn't be warming up. And hey, by the way, the order for rehearsals on the board, and so get some things into order there and think about what's in. And by the way, percussionists, you could be looking ahead to the third piece, and do we have that stuff? Can we set that? All of those things need to at some point be taught. And ultimately, and I think this is maybe why this is maybe a great gateway into some more specifics with regards to individual independence, is that we need our students to be able to do that and be independent in that. Because if not, the beginnings of rehearsals are chaos. And I don't mean that they should be like regimented, but bringing our students into a sense for what a competent, mature, independent musician does to prepare for rehearsal when they come into a rehearsal room, that's important stuff for us to teach. And so if I have in my mind what I want the rehearsal room to look like, then I can work backwards from there and say, okay, here's what I here are the things that you should be doing no matter what time you come into the band room, because there's always that student who somehow like 2 seconds after the bell rings, they're already in the room. It's like, where did you come from? How did you get here? And
Jim,
then
they
there's the
came from
student at the
Jim because
other,
the gym is right
yeah,
there. Yeah.
right, exactly. And then there's the student at the other end of the spectrum who, like, the bell rings and they're barely crossing the threshold at that time, and yet rehearsal is going to start at prescribed time. So how do those students, different as they are, come into an understanding of what those expectations are? And I purport that the more that we can spell out and lead our students through those things, so that percussionists, here are the expectations, the behavioral expectations and the cultural expectations, really musical cultural expectations that I expect you to live into. And wind musicians, here are the cultural expectations that we have as a wind musician. And then we need to remember that our job is not to be attending to email and this, that, and the other, but monitoring all of this. And with the student who is finally doing what it is they're supposed to be doing, kind of saying, hey, way to go. I noticed that you're terrific, and complimenting students who are doing things and redirecting those who need that. But the more specific we can be about what do we want the very beginnings of rehearsal to look like, that can set us up for great success. And again, is viable
and
in that
and
regard.
then you can give them immediate feedback. You heard them do this, and then you can
Yes.
say there's this one kid doing
Mm-hmm.
this, but you're going to say in general, let's try doing it this way
Yeah.
instead of this way, and you don't have to point that kid out. I'll give you a couple examples of things I've done with that warm up. I had this band like 10 years ago. I've said this on the podcast with other people who I talked with about at the time, who they walked in and they just sat there, horn on their lap, not
Mm,
playing. Like no matter what I did, I couldn't get them to just warm up no matter everything I
interesting.
did. So I walked in the room one day and I said, I'm going to try this. I said, I wrote on the board, play 600 notes before we start rehearsal.
There it is.
You would have
Ready to go.
sworn we were the Boston Symphony. I mean, there was like scales everywhere and double tongue, like all this, because they were just
Yes,
trying to get to that. And I told a friend,
that
and a
number.
very experienced band director, Jeff Priest, and he's like, Kyle, you're full of it. I'm not doing that. This is the Old Town Band. We do this, this, and this. We're not doing that.
Yes.
Well,
Uh-huh.
he went the
Uh-huh.
next, he's like, he did it. And he's like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, did it work? Now
It works. Yeah.
on the other side, the other day I
Yep.
heard a kid on trumpet. The first thing he played was a 2-octave F scale, which is
Ah,
cool. I'm a trumpet player, and before we've warmed
yeah.
up, we've got mad chops. Well,
Uh-huh.
4 minutes later, you're not going to be able to play anything.
Yes.
So I
Right.
had to say, hey, as part of our warm up, we're not playing, up to high F until you've done,
Yes.
other things. So I think it's like having that pulse of what are they doing now and how do I get them to what I want. I will say, like, there's a warm up book Chip DeStefano uses. I forget what it's called.
Oh yeah.
He wrote it. I forget what it's called, but in there is like a prescribed warm up and a prescribed advanced warm up for each instrument. So just coming up with something to say, here's a sheet, pick the front or the back, wherever you're at today, and just
Yeah.
do it.
And that's where I was going to head with this. So beautiful segue in that regard. I think one of the questions that you confront, if it's like, okay, I know what I want the beginning of rehearsal to be like, that sound in the room, that energy in the room. The reality is what is it that you want them to do musically on their instruments? And that's going to be different for a flute player than it's going to be for a tuba player, than it's going to be for percussionists, and it's going to be. And by having those individual warm-up sheets, there's this is exactly what I'd like you to do in this order. And then you can decide, like, do I want every student who's a wind player starting with some breathing exercises? And do I want brass players and then next moving to the mouthpiece only? And do I want flutes to do some things with just the head joint, or all of those things, which not only pay dividends at the beginning of rehearsal, but when that student gets home and they get their instrument out to practice,
Yep.
they know exactly the things to do first. Because I would love to tell you that our students are thinking that way, but without being brought to that, they tend to get the instrument out, make sure they're ready to go, open the piece of music and dive in. And that's another kind of cultural awareness and part of, a competent, thoughtful, complete, independent musician does specific things before they start to practice by themselves or with others. So yes, beginning with the ends in minds, even at the very beginning of class, before it even feels like we're teaching, but
Mm-hmm.
actually we're teaching from the minute they walk into the room.
What would you say is sort of the
Mm-hmm.
ultimate independence model when it comes to band?
Mm,
Like, what does that look like?
yeah. So, so I'll just tick off the other dimensions of independence that are meaningful to me and that I've moved through in my own teaching, partly because my students were wrestling, like that 6/8 example I was telling you. Much of my insight into teaching and learning has come from failing with my own students and going,
Right.
how do I get them to do this? Like, how does this work? And then retooling. So there's rhythmic independence, which again, we talked about developing a rhythmic vocabulary and ultimately pattern recall, rich pattern vocabulary. And I'll just mention that if people are looking for some ways to develop a rhythmic vocabulary with their students, I created a website that's free and it's a resource. It's called Emile, Emile, and the URL is emilrhythm.com. And there's some YouTube videos right there that kind of show what it is and how it works. But it's basically there are about 1,800 different rhythm patterns and different time signatures, and grouped according to different rhythmic notations that you can use to create these slideshows, which can then be projected onto a screen or actually used on just a tablet with your students. But so rhythmic independence for sure. Intonational independence, and this was the focus of my doctoral dissertation. How do I get students to be able to play in tune, not just the third measure of letter A or the fifth measure of letter D, but I want my students to play in tune all the time and to make adjustments on their own without me. So how do I nurture that? And the reality is, when you think deeply about it, begin with the end in mind and work backwards, there are things that a complete independent, intonationally independent musician does and has the ability to do. Once we figure out what those things are, then we just teach those things and our students start to move along in their journey there as well.
Uh,
Then there's style. Oh, go ahead.
a really practical way that I do that for intonation. Not that my students play the most in tune, and we all have issues, but it's all
Oh,
about the
sure.
trios. Who's the person on either side of you or in front and back,
Yeah.
and you're always
Yeah.
playing in that trio, and you're always trying to match your sound with those
Yeah,
around you. And I just notice when I
absolutely.
say that, it's like, boom, it's like a whole new band.
Isn't
So
that great?
that's a practical way to do it.
Yeah, and ultimately you're reminding them when it comes to that particular set of skills. Whoop, let me remind you, trios, try again, and poof, like, oh
Yep.
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last one I'll mention is just style. So, and this kind of goes back to your Duke Ellington example earlier. There are things that stylistically independent musicians do that are not on the page. And if we stop long enough and think about them, like one of those things is that at a moderately fast tempo and faster, any note that's not beneath a slur or above a slur always has a little bit of space between it, silence. Well, there's nothing on the page that your students are going to see to do that, but a competent musician stylistically uh, will just automatically do that. Well, our students need to be brought to that. And not just at measure 12, but actually out of the context again, and then
Mm-hmm.
applying that to the context. And when the ensemble starts doing that, like it's night and day. I mean, holy cow, music starts to dance and it starts to sing and all the things in between that it needs to as well. So, where all of these, to your question now about what the ultimate is, where all of these things led was my first experiences here at Ohio State. And I conduct our second band, a group of students that I love, and I enjoy that part of being part of that journey as they are here and learning to become, by and large, music educators. That's a big part of what we do in our School of Music. And one of the things that I was confronted with is here are all these really remarkable students, both as people and as musicians, who are very happy to look right at me and say, "What do you want me to do?" And I thought, well, what I want you to do is realize that what you're playing and what the person 2 rows behind you is playing is the same thing, and you're not together, or that's not in tune. Like, what I really want you to do is to be able to do more on your own without me. Like, I'm flattered. Thank you for asking. It's lovely that you're ready for me. But if I have to give you everything, this is not going to go anywhere quickly. And oh, by the way, if you're going to be teachers, like, that we can't perpetuate that we're the only people in the room with answers. So inspired by the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, an orchestra in New York City that is now more than 50 years been making internationally renowned music without a conductor, without somebody on a podium waving a baton. I thought, what would this look like if we were to treat a concert band, a large university concert band of 70 musicians or so, like the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra? And so, what we have since 2014, we shared this way of making music at the Midwest Clinic. And since that time, have continued to explore and refine, and others around the country and around the world are trying this as well. And so, in essence, what this becomes is my role as a teacher is to set them up to be able to rehearse themselves and perform without me. And it's a vastly different, it's not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't offer it as a replacement for traditional conductor led music making, but I have found it to be an amazing partner for traditional music making with the conductor for our students, because they then are deciding what it is that they're stopping for, how they're going to address issues, what it is that they're trying to do on behalf of this piece that was a creation of this particular composer. Does the arrival feel like these words that we've decided in our group score study that we want this moment to feel glorious? Does it feel glorious, or does it just feel loud? And watching them wrestle with those things is amazing to watch. It can be overwhelming at first, but to go back to the issue of our students surprising us, I have continued to be nothing but bowled over at how much students, when they're set up properly for this kind of way of making music, it's amazing to watch what they're capable of doing. And we've got a couple of high school bands here in the state of Ohio who will actually, for their district festival performance, they've actually, one of their 3 compositions, they've had be a conductor, a collaborative, we call it, collaborative rehearsal process where the conductor leaves the stage and the students play without them, and then they go on with their program. Uh, so that to me is the ultimate, because they're entrusted with all of these things that we're
Yeah.
talking about: intonation, style, rhythm, all of those kinds of things.
For anybody who might be considering doing that, can you give, I mean, you've done this a lot for the average teacher.
Yeah,
What are some practical things that they would need to make sure they can do in order to, try to achieve this?
Yeah, the biggest misconception is people think about like, oh gosh, you're taking the conductor away. And the reality is like, nope, what we're doing is we're empowering all of the students in the ensemble to live into the role of a conductor. So somebody still has to start the first measure and those critical moments in the piece. So when you start with the end in mind and think, what are all those things that the students are going to need to have the ability to do? And then you start giving them those skills out of the context, things go great. So for instance, everybody in your ensemble needs to understand how to move and take a breath and start a phrase. And by the way, that same gesture can be used also to give a release. But gosh, you could have students start, the first note of your rehearsal that way, or lead a scale. Like, hey, everybody, today we're going to follow Sam. Everybody, Sam, and get so you can see. And well, I can't see him. Well, then stand up if you need to, or do whatever you need. And then Sam leads each note of the scale. So that's one dimension there. Another best practice that we've learned just by the nature of the size of the groups is that when somebody has something to say, they stand up to say it. And that's really, quite honestly, a logistical issue. It's just hard to hear somebody in the fifth row when you're all the way across the ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that you could just do, knowing that maybe in the spring you are going to be doing this kind of collaborative rehearsal, is early in the year, just start to make that part of the norm. That if you've got something to offer when you ask a question or you call on a student, just say, hey, pop right up and what's the answer to that? Okay, great. And then that starts to become normal, normalized in that way. Ultimately, what we as the degreed professionals that we are, where our role comes in to play most is that we need to somehow lead a group score study of the composition that's going to be rehearsed this way. So for instance, what we really need to do is make sure that every student in the ensemble has it's clear an image of what it is they're striving for before they start to rehearse. I mean, it's kind of interesting to toss them into the deep end of the pool and watch them splash around. It can be exciting without that. But none of us would ever get in front of our group with no idea of what we're hoping for and feel good about that. And it's the same thing with them. So like here at Ohio State, when we would do this, we'd spend the first half of the semester studying together the score. And each of the students has their own score to use and mark, and they're working together on those things. And then the second concert of the semester is when they're actually engaged in the process. So it's not an efficient way to make music. So you have to not be, the outcome can't be just efficiency, because if that's the goal, it's always going to be more efficient for us to make all the decisions and say, follow me, be compliant.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a beautiful thing when students have the freedom to stand up and make a contribution and to say, hey, I think we could do that differently. Let's try this. And everybody is afforded the opportunity to contribute like that. It's a really beautiful, it's a beautiful thing to witness. And with like everything our students do, the more practice they have doing that, the better they get at it. So I have resources that I'm happy to share with anybody if they want to reach out to me. As a matter of fact, some of them are connected to my faculty page at Ohio State, but I'm always happy to share. There's really almost not a week that goes by where I don't get an email or a phone call from a teacher somewhere in the country that says, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And I just want to know, how do I start? Where am I to go with this?
Mm-hmm.
So love those conversations, and it's always interesting, and it's fun to then hear how's it going and what are you learning and what are your students learning.
Have you found that there's like a style of piece that tends to be a good first one to do? Like, is it better to do this with a march at first, or a simple ballad, or what do you think?
I appreciate something that's a little bit more lyrical in its affect to begin with, because I think it's a little bit easier for our students to grasp emotional content. Because what the students will tend to want to do is get just consumed with the mechanics of the piece. Let's start together, let's stay together, let's get that in tune, let's do whatever. And the reality is like, well, okay, that all serves a higher purpose. And calling them into that higher purpose is about them understanding that, hey, this is what this piece is about. And remember, on the inside of the score, here's what this piece is about that the composer wrote, or that work that you did together and you decided this piece was about X, Y, or Z. The music has to have that quality when you're playing together. And if you're not feeling anything, there's nothing magic that's going to happen out for the listener. So I think lyrical music is a way to go. It's more challenging in that regard, and particularly mentioning the percussionists, finding music that has thoughtful percussion engagement with lyrical music is not every piece. So, finding again the right piece, which is about that fit that we were talking about earlier in our conversation. Um, but it works. I've also done it with marches, and that's great. It's just a little less complex in that regard. It's very easy in a march for them to get, are we slowing down or speeding up? And is it together or is it not together? And is that note length too long or too short? And that very often is where they kind of get stuck a bit. So many ways to the end with that process, but pretty fascinating. And again, not something I was doing early in my teaching career. As a matter of fact, I didn't start doing that until I got to Ohio State, which is 7, 8 years into my college teaching. So I wish that I'd stumbled upon this in the 15 years I was a public school teacher, because what you have the ability to do is to nurture a culture around this year to year to year to year to year. At the university level, the musicians are very often changing semester to semester to semester. And so that sense of institutional knowledge about this way of making music goes out the door with some of them. Whereas in a high school program, we've got students for 4 years, you could really make some pretty amazing things. And there are teachers who are doing that happen with that. So I just wasn't ready for that idea yet, I guess, when that time came. I was still trying to figure out how to teach students to be intonationally independent and rhythmically independent. So,
well, Scott, thanks so much for the conversation. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for being here.
Kyle, my absolute pleasure, and thank you for the honor, really, of being part of this series. You have nurtured just a remarkable collection of conversations that I'm just now steeping myself in and learning a lot from the videos I've watched. So to the extent that this has helped with others, great. And if I can be of service in any way, please let me know.
Thank you.
All right.
We sincerely appreciate you taking your valuable time and listening to the Growing Band Director podcast. Your students are very lucky to have a band director like you. If you have any suggestions for episode topics or think you have an area of expertise to share on a show with us, please reach out. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your band director friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to The Growing Band Director. See you next week.